This pro-Israel speech is absolutely disgusting. It is delivered by the second most important member of Britain's Labour government. That's Rachel Reeves, who's the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Finance Minister, for now. We'll see how long she lasts. Could be a matter of weeks. And it was delivered to Labour Friends of Israel, a pro-Israel lobbying organisation. It's utterly disgusting. It conflates opposition to Israel's heinous crimes with anti-Semitism. It airbrushes Israel's atrocities. It turns reality on its head. It makes no attempt to treat Palestinian life as having even a fraction of the worth of an Israeli life. It's an instructive speech, which I'm going to go through, and I'm going to expose just how awful it is. Because it reflects the position of Britain's political elite and the West's political elite, how their worldview has proven immune to 2 years of daily genocidal depravity, including some of the worst crimes it's possible for humans to commit. That as a genocide facilitated by this Labour government, including Rachel Reeves as the second most important member of that particular government. Now, I mean, Rachel Reeves will be remembered as one of the worst chancellors in the history of British democracy. And she is monstrously unpopular. And she should know that because, you know, her place in history is assured, and that is as a catastrophe. And part of that catastrophe isn't just the disastrous policies she's inflicted on Britain, but it is being someone who helped facilitate one of the worst crimes of that age. I'll start by including this particular chunk of her speech, as well as the contribution of the parliamentary chair of LFI, Mark Seward. And so you can get the gist. I mean, it's let me put this bluntly. She ain't no charismatic tour de force. Normally one of the most wooden politicians imaginable. But that notwithstanding, what she says, and you can hear part of what she says here, again, just underlines what we're up against.
We must not tacitly accept the distortion that Zionism is something that has to be apologised for, or worse yet, a label to be surrendered to conspiracy theorists and anti-Semites. The progressive Friends of Israel, whatever their criticism of particular governments, must be willing to say unapologetically, I am a Zionist. Not in spite of my belief in democracy or freedom and equality, but exactly because of those beliefs. Confronting the roots of anti-Semitism is a great moral challenge for all of us.
But our voices in Britain will not be heard, and nor will we be deserved to be heard, until we confront the anti-Semitic hatred we have witnessed throughout our nation since the pogrom on October the 7th. Hatred which we've seen displayed in demonstrations which started while Hamas terrorists were still committing barbarous acts across southern Israel. Hatred which has shamefully led to the Jewish community centers and places of worship being deliberately targeted by anti-Israel protesters. And hatred which culminated in the devastating terror attack at the Heaton Park Synagogue on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar.
We must speak out, because every word has consequences, and every silence does too.
Goodness me, where to begin? Well, I'll respond directly to some of the comments she made specifically there. But I'm going to go through the speech. She started in this speech by saying, it's such a privilege to follow Gordon Brown, Tony Blair, Isaac Herzog, and Keir Starmer last year in making this address. Isaac Herzog. That's who she says it was an honour to follow doing this address. He's the president of Israel. And he issued one of the, just avalanche of genocidal statements by Israeli leaders and officials, which you cannot divorce, as I'll explain, from the actual genocidal depravity which Israel has inflicted against the Palestinian people. Let's just listen to what Isaac Herzog said at the beginning of Israel's genocide against the Palestinian people.
It's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true. This rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved, it's absolutely not true. They could have risen up. They could have fought against that evil regime which took over Gaza in a coup d'etat. But we're at war. We are at war. We're at war we are defending our homes. We're protecting our homes. That's the truth. And then when a nation protects its home, it fights. And we will fight until we'll break their backbone.
Now, recently, a UN commission established the incontrovertible reality, which is that Israel has committed genocide against the Palestinian people. And it cited in its findings Isaac Herzog and his genocidal statement, making very clear that it was the position of the Israeli state that the Palestinian people of Gaza had a form of collective guilt, which is then used to commit genocide. Because what that notion of collective guilt, which Isaac Herzog believes in, means in practice is the destruction of any demarcation between those who are seen as civilians and those who are seen as military targets. What it means is the Palestinian civilian population are legitimate targets in the eyes of Israeli soldiers. That's what it means in practice. Because you know, this idea of there were no innocent people in Gaza, which has been repeatedly stated from the very top to the very bottom of Israeli society. The Genocide Convention of 1948, which Britain and Israel are signatories to, criminalizes 5 acts. And one of them is the public incitement of genocide. Because the basis of that criminalization is that all genocides begin with words, is what it is said to demonize an entire people. And what Isaac Herzog obviously did with his massive platform is to demonize the Palestinian population as his military was already unleashing hell against its people. And indeed, Israeli soldiers on the ground went on to integrate what he said in their own utterances, chants, graffiti, that kind of thing. There's a direct link between what the likes of Isaac Herzog said and what permission Israeli soldiers believed they had in terms of how they behaved against the people of Gaza. Now, we've had all this talk, have we not? All this focus on the rhetoric used by those who oppose genocide. I mean, this is just itself when you spell it out like this. It's those who oppose genocide who are being inflammatory. It's those who oppose genocide who are using inflammatory rhetoric which incites violence. Like, for example, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That is seen as genocidal. In actual fact, it means that all Palestinians, wherever they are, will be free. Whether that be, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in pre-1967 borders of Israel. But in the Likud founding charter, it has the same thing about there will only be Israel between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea. Netanyahu has publicly said that, the Prime Minister of Israel. And what that means in practice is we will deprive the Palestinians forever of any right to national self-determination, and we will subject the Palestinian population to an eternity of occupation, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and genocide, which is what Israel has done to the Palestinian people between the river and the sea. And yet, we have this moral panic in an attempt to criminalize anyone who opposes genocide being committed by Israel against the Palestinian people. And yet Labour politicians can just laud Israeli politicians who have been found to actually incite genocide. The world has turned on its head. Now, she says, LFI, Labour Friends of Israel, gave me the opportunity to visit Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Israel, to see the pioneering work of Israeli businesses and startups, and to meet Israeli and Palestinian political leaders, thinkers, and commentators. And they affirmed my belief in the importance of the Jewish homeland and my understanding of the complexities of the conflict. Yeah, I can really see LFI, Labour Friends of Israel, giving a really rounded trip to Israel and indeed occupied Palestine. I can imagine the Palestinian thinkers and commentators, I'm sure there was a really representative section. I'd love to know which Palestinian figures she actually met. love to know, could you name them? Love to know who she's talking about there. But yes, Labour Friends of Israel, I'm sure they really, really did show the complexities of the conflict. I'm sure that's absolutely, I mean, this is just ludicrous. These trips organised by pro-Israel lobbying organisations like Labour Friends of Israel, which you don't need to, don't need to spend long trying to work out what the aim of Labour Friends of Israel is based on the name. Like if there was an organisation called Labour Friends of Russia, which organised trips to Russia, I don't, what do we think those trips were aiming to do? Well, I'll tell you what those trips were aiming to do. They are aiming to, as Rachel Reeves has illustrated, to make politicians be more pro, in this case, Israel. That's what we're trying to do, And she talks about the complexities of conflict. What complexities did they open her eyes to? What? I mean, were her eyes open to, for example, what before the genocide, the likes of Amnesty International had concluded was apartheid being instituted by the Israeli state against the people of Palestine? I went to the West Bank in September. Did she travel around the West Bank and see what the Palestinians were being subjected to like I did? Did she see Palestinians trapped in their homes in cages because Israeli settlers who are completely illegal, 700,000 or so illegal Israeli settlers in the West Bank, are literally building on the land of those Palestinians, building homes so that what the Palestinians are just end up their homes in a cage structure where those Israeli settlers throw things at the children of the Palestinians living there, where, Palestinians can't walk on the roads of Hebron, which I could walk on because I'm not Palestinian. Did she see all those realities? Did she see the suffocating vice that Palestinians in the West Bank can be subjected to? What complexities was she awoken to? Well, as I've said, we know actually what these trips are for and what they succeed in doing. And they are there to give a one-sided view of what Israel is doing, and that is, in reality, airbushing reality. That is airbushing the truth of what Israel is doing to the Palestinian people. Now, she says in the speech, she says, none of us will forget the stories of the horrors inflicted on those border communities by Hamas terrorists. None of us will forget meeting the families of the hostages, hearing their pain and anger and seeing their courage and fortitude. She says Hamas were guilty of premeditated rape, torture, and mutilation of Israeli civilians. What language does she use when she's talking about Israel's genocidal onslaught against the people of Gaza? Well, compare and contrast. Over the past 2 years, the actions of the Israeli government are not and must not be beyond criticism. This Labour government has not shied away from that. The scenes from Gaza on our televisions are shocking and heartbreaking. No parent doesn't feel pain and empathy when they see other people's children suffering. Can we just take a minute just to remember what Israel has done and is doing to the people of Gaza? Israel wiped Gaza from the face of the earth. That's what it did. It exploded firepower equivalent to several Hiroshima bombs in an area the size of East London. Air Wars, an NGO of experts, analysed just the first few weeks of that aerial bombardment of Gaza, where what they saw was the most destructive air campaign that they had ever analysed in just the first few weeks. Thousands of innocent civilians murdered. A tiny fraction of those killed, they noted, a tiny, tiny, tiny number, were actually members of Hamas. So it was just overwhelmingly civilians. And indeed, we know from a leaked account that in the first phase of the genocide, that the Israeli general, chief of staff, at a cabinet meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu, came up with a list of targets. And Benjamin Netanyahu said that wasn't enough. He wanted thousands. And they said, we don't have 1,000 targets. And he said he didn't care. He wanted the homes that, destroy the homes of the Palestinian people. It's just completely, wiped from the face of the earth. According to The Economist, which supported Israel's genocidal onslaught, by May of this year, the upper limit, they thought, of Palestinians killed by violence alone was around 110,000. And the low estimate was still much higher than the official death toll in Gaza, which has been repeatedly undermined and claimed that it's an exaggeration when actually it's a drastic underestimate. And when I say just talked about violence, the number of people killed violently, that excludes those killed because the hospital system's been destroyed, that people don't have shelter, that people are starved, that people are repeatedly displaced, disease. I mean, lack of fresh water, trauma. I mean, we could go on. We have no idea how many people Israel has actually killed. We know it's a vast number. And we know as a percentage of the population in Gaza, it has no parallel with another conflict in the 21st century. That's not talking about the number who've been maimed. The biggest number of, for example, child amputees on the face of the earth. The biggest proportion of children who've been amputated. Without talking about the deliberate starvation of the people of Gaza, which is what Israel has done, without talking about the mass kidnapping of innocent people who are then incarcerated and then starved and tortured and raped. Dozens of them have been killed in Israeli custody. I mean, she talks about meeting the families of the hostages. She means Israeli hostages. What about Palestinian hostages? And they are hostages, by the way, because this is what happens. You either get people, Palestinians, who go through military courts, and that includes children. Israel's the only country on earth that routinely puts children through military courts. They're kangaroo courts. They're presided over by an Israeli soldier, an Israeli officer. They're over in minutes. They're conducted in Hebrew. Or you get people who are detained indefinitely with no charge at all, no trial, nothing. They're hostages. They're just kidnapped in the middle of the night, taken away from their families, no legal process at all. They haven't done anything in vast number of cases. I mean, in the case of children going through military courts, what kids who thrown stones at soldiers who then get incarcerated. We know from Save the Children before the genocide began did a report which looked at the sexual abuse of Palestinian children in custody. But she doesn't talk about how she'll never forget meeting the families of Palestinian hostages because she didn't meet any, did she? She didn't meet Palestinians whose relatives, whose loved ones were being held in Israeli torture chambers. When soldiers they were filmed raping a Palestinian detainee, and there were pro-rape riots in Israel, attended by Israeli ministers in the government. And then it was found out what the chief military attorney was responsible for leaking it, and now she's the one in the midst of a firestorm facing the consequences for leaking it. But we know there's overwhelming numbers of accounts of Palestinians being raped, and the witnessing of rapes, including rape by dogs. That's what we're talking about. She doesn't talk about, how, is the consensus of genocide scholars that Israel has committed genocide, including Israeli genocide scholars. The Amnesty International to Israeli human rights organizations at Bethlehem have concluded that Israel has committed genocide. What she says is, the actions of the Israeli government are not and must not be beyond criticism. I mean, we're talking about the most extreme crimes imaginable. And, she's basically said, well, no one's perfect. That's basically what the tone of that is. And then she says the scenes from Gaza are shocking and heartbreaking. No parent doesn't feel pain and empathy when they see other people's children suffering. You were supplying weapons to, and still are, to F-35 jets, which are responsible for those children suffering because they've dropped bombs in them and burned them to death in rubble, Rachel. What pain and empathy do you really feel? Do you feel when you think about those children suffering? I mean, it's very plausible that tens of thousands of Palestinian children have been killed. 20,000 is a minimum, by the way, but that's based on official figures, which are a drastic underestimate. Your view is that pain, that suffering that you're talking about of children was entirely tolerable because you would never, ever allow or countenance tens of thousands of Israeli children to be murdered or to suffer starvation and all the other horrors. Rightly so. But you don't extend that to Palestinian children at all. I would love to know how much pain and empathy you actually feel. I don't have windows into your soul. How much have you wept over the children of Gaza? How much did you weep over Hind Rajab, a 6-year-old Palestinian girl in a car with 4 of her cousins, all children, as her aunt and uncle tried to drive them to safety? And then her 15-year-old cousin rang the Palestine Red Crescent begging for help. With an Israeli tank, which was, it was all broad daylight, just next to them, had fired on that tank, had fired on that family, murdering everyone except then Hind and her cousin. And then you hear, again, the tank firing bullets at that car, murdering their cousin. And then 5-year-old Hind Rajab rang the Palestine Red Crescent. You can hear her begging on the phone, terrified little girl. It was getting dark, and she was sitting there with the bodies of her family as she herself was bleeding to death, begging for help, saying she was scared of the dark. Did you weep for her, Rachel? When you feel pain and empathy for Hind Rajab, what does that mean in practice? The Israeli army murdered her and her family, including several of the children. That's just one example. Do you know what they also did? When the ambulance was sent to rescue her, and they coordinated with the Israeli army, including sending the coordinates and being sent the route to go. And when the ambulance arrived, the Israeli army blew up the ambulance, incinerating that ambulance and the 2 paramedics. Virtually nothing was left of their bodies by the end of that. Just a heinous crime beyond description. Children deliberately murdered. Yes, deliberately murdered. Because you see, the New York Times, Rachel Reeves, which is not a pro-Israel organisation, media organisation, let's put it bluntly, they did a detailed investigation based on the testimonies of dozens of US-based medics, which found, according to all their testimonies, that Palestinian children were being routinely shot in the head and the chest by the Israeli army. Do you think it's an accident that just being repeatedly shot in the head and the chest? It just happens to be the head and the chest over and over again. Those are Israeli snipers. It's one of the most sophisticated militaries on earth. You know that. I interviewed Dr. Nick Maynard, a very prestigious Oxford-based medic who has served 3 times in Gaza during the genocide. I interviewed him. He said on one day he would find young teenagers coming to hospital and they'd be shot in the head. Another day it would be the chest, for example. Another day the abdomen. Another day the testicles. He said they were playing a game, Rachel. That's your ally doing that. That's a state you are lauding and arming. Do you think they're all making it up? Are they all anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, including the Jewish doctors who served in Gaza who said the same thing? Is that what you think? You don't feel any meaningful pain and empathy for those children. Of course you don't, because you would not have facilitated what was happening to them if you did. It's a lie. And you talk about the pain and suffering inflicted against Israelis in a raw sense, which shows you're emotionally affected. And then you just say, basically, the Israeli government, well, you know, no one's perfect. Of course, there are things they've done which we don't agree with. You're talking about a state that's committed genocide, Rachel. And she goes on to speak of young men and women serving on the border, that's Israeli soldiers, attempting to preserve the fragile ceasefire which Hamas have repeatedly broken. Oh my God. Wow. Gaslighting. Off the scale. In 2023 alone, before the 7th of October, the Israeli army, yes, including young men and women who are soldiers, had killed 240 Palestinians, including 40 kids. That was 2023 alone. The vast majority of those were in the West Bank, by the way, which is not governed by Hamas. The last time before the 7th of October Israel had attacked Gaza was May 2023. It was a few months before. It was actually justified as an attack on Islamic Jihad. They killed 6 children in that one attack, which I doubt you even remember, because Palestinian life is so cheap in reality, in your worldview. I mean, you know, the Israeli onslaughts against Gaza have, in each case, murdered, well, cumulatively, they've murdered thousands of people. And NGOs like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch found that the Israeli army had committed grievous war crimes and crimes against humanity in those onslaughts. I mean, you know, if 240 Israelis, including 40 kids, had been killed in 2023 by Palestinian militants, you would not be saying, hey, there was a ceasefire, would you? No, of course you wouldn't. But it is a ceasefire if the Israeli army are firing. That still counts as a ceasefire in your worldview. Because as you say there, you say, well, actually, it was Hamas that repeatedly broke the ceasefire, even though the Israeli army was just murdering Palestinians willy-nilly. She goes on to say, while Hamas's leadership hid in a tunnel network the size of London Underground, it used the people of Gaza, their schools and hospitals as human shields. Necessary sacrifices, in the words of Yahya Sinwar. Human shields to safeguard its arsenal of weapons, to imprison the innocent hostages it sought to trade for killers held in Israeli prisons. Oh my God. And to protect its brutal authoritarian and corrupt grip on power, resulting in thousands of innocent Palestinian deaths. What we're discussing here is genocidal apologism. What she's doing is stripping accountability and guilt from Israel and saying in practical terms that those who had been murdered by the Israeli army, that is not the Israeli army responsible, it's Hamas because they're using its people as human shields. Now, the definition of human shield, I would love to know what her definition is. Because what it generally means in practice is the claim that there are military targets which are located amongst, kind of in proximity to civilian communities. So when Iran was attacking Israel, sending missiles to Israel, we had the CNN journalist reporting who said there was fears of possible civilian casualties in Israel because, for example, the Mossad headquarters was located amongst a civilian community. Is Israel using civilians as human shields, given Mossad is located there? The IDF headquarters also, by the way, in a civilian area. There were flats, there were homes, there were shops. I mean, pretty much every country on the world does the same. But weirdly, most people don't just whack all their military headquarters in the middle of a desert somewhere with a big target on it saying, these are our military targets, by the way. I mean, Gaza is the size of East London and is one of the most densely populated communities, or was, on the face of the earth. What do you mean by human shields? Because let's talk about actual human shields. It's been found over and over again, including by newspapers which have whitewashed Israeli crimes, by the way, like the New York Times, like the Washington Post, like CNN. They've all found that the Israeli army routinely use Palestinians as human shields. What do I mean by that? Oh, I'll give you an example. This is what they do. This was revealed, for example, in Israeli newspapers, such as Haaretz. This one example. An 80-year-old Palestinian man. And what the Israeli army did is they attached a dog collar to him, which was riddled with explosives. And he could barely walk. And they made him go into home after home to check to see if it was booby-trapped. So then if there were any explosives, he would be blown up. And they said if he didn't cooperate, they would detonate his dog collar and blow his head off. And they spent hours taking him home after home to see if there were any explosives there. And then they ordered him and his also elderly wife, after hours of this, to flee for safety on foot. Within minutes, they were mowed down by the Israeli army in the street, their bodies left to decompose. Those are human shields, Rachel. That's what human shield is. And that's you know, the use of Palestinians to go and check for explosives and all the rest of it is routine. You said, for example, how they imprisoned the innocent hostages it sought to trade for killers held in Israeli prisons. It's a lie to say that all of the Palestinian detainees, as I've gone through, are killers. That's just not true. Thousands of thousands of them are just there because they're Palestinian. They've not been charged with anything. They've not been tried with anything. So many of those who've been charged and tried aren't actually guilty of anything, but they've gone through a kangaroo court. How dare you? What do you think these kids, you think little kids who've been detained, they're all killers? That's why they're in Israeli prisons. If you believe that, you're stupid. In any case, you don't know what you're talking about. Or you're lying. Which is it? You don't know what you're talking about. The Israeli army is responsible for killing thousands of innocent Palestinians. I mean, you say thousands of innocent Palestinian deaths. They killed Palestinians en masse. And it's not because of the use of human shields. They wiped Gaza from the face of the earth. There are virtually no buildings left standing, Rachel. Do you think there were just human shields in every building? It's just genocidal apologism. That's what it is. She says, the ceasefire agreed in October has provided a glimmer of hope. The joy and relief we all felt when we saw the hostages back home in Israel with their families and loved ones. The much needed space to get more aid flowing into Gaza to meet the plight of its people. And the opportunity to begin the process of reconstruction. Well, what ceasefire, actually, Rachel? Because Israel is murdering. It's killed vast numbers of Palestinians since the so-called ceasefire was agreed. That's what's happened. I mean, just the other day, they killed several people, Palestinians who were sheltering in a school. You would not call that a ceasefire, would you? You would not call that a ceasefire if vast numbers of Israelis were being killed by Hamas or the Palestinian militants. Of course you wouldn't. You would never think that. And I've gone on again. You don't talk about the Palestinian hostages. I want to give you an example, actually, one of those kids. One child hostage, a 7-year-old Walid Khalid Abdullah Ahmad. He died in Megadoo prison on March the 22nd from starvation, dehydration, and infections caused by prolonged malnutrition and medical neglect. Towards the beginning of the genocide, I interviewed the Israeli journalist Gideon Levy, and he said that the conditions, on average, suffered by Israeli hostages was worse. Sorry, the conditions suffered by Palestinian hostages, those held by Israel, were worse than that of Israeli hostages. And that's absolutely true. Of course, it's outrage when you say it's true, though. Dozens of, large numbers of Israeli hostages have been killed by the Israeli army as they flattened them. I mean, one case, they killed 3 Israeli hostages as they were waving a white flag. They were stripped themselves to their underpants and they were yelling in Hebrew. That's not to say, by the way, that it was acceptable to take Israeli civilian hostage. I don't, obviously, I think that is a war crime, by the way. But where does that leave the Israeli state? Because they've kidnapped thousands of Palestinians without any charge. But you don't talk about that. I mean, you say how, because then you talk about the much needed space to get more aid flowing into Gaza to meet the plight of people. You go on, you say the challenge is now that it requires the Israeli government to lift all restrictions on the flow of humanitarian assistance. Why don't you just call it out for what it is, which is they have deliberately starved the people of Gaza, Rachel. That's what they did. They've announced it over and over again. The International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu and his former defense minister, Yoav Gallant, with the core charge of starvation. I mean, you don't mention the fact the International Criminal Court, which your country is a founding member of, has issued those arrest warrants, because there's overwhelming and incontrovertible evidence in practice of the most hideous war crimes and crimes against humanity imaginable. You don't absolutely just say you're not putting any actual pressure on the Israeli government. You're not imposing sweeping sanctions. You're not ending all arms sales. You're carrying on £6 billion worth of trade every year with Israel. This is just empty rhetoric without holding them actually guilty of a terrible crime. I mean, you don't say anything about Israel, carrying on bombing Israelis, as I've said. You also, in terms about the challenge of the future, you say it demands that the family of Ran Givili, the Israeli police officer, who is waiting almost 800 days for his return from Gaza, so that it can lay him to rest and begin to grieve, or made to wait no longer. They're talking here about this Israeli police officer who was kidnapped by Palestinian militants, and he's the last dead hostage who's not been returned to his family because they can't locate his remains. Obviously, we should want his remains to be returned to his family. Of course we should. But isn't it fascinating how that one dead hostage or one dead Israeli police officer and his body not being returned is put on the same level playing field as not starving the surviving population of Gaza? She doesn't talk, does she, about the hundreds of Palestinian bodies which are kept by the Israeli authorities. Their bodies are being held hostage. Let alone the thousands of Palestinian civilians, including children, who are buried under rubble, many of whom their remains will never be found. Some of them were eaten by starving cats and dogs, long decomposed. Their families unable to grieve for them. How dare you? There's no pretense that Palestinian civilians have even the tiniest fraction of worth. Because one decomposed body, which has not been found, of one Israeli police officer is worth infinitely more, as it happens to you, than the Palestinian people, including those thousands of bodies of Palestinian civilians. It's just grotesque. She says that means we must not tacitly accept the distortion that Zionism is something to be apologized for, or worse yet, a label to be surrendered to conspiracy theorists and anti-Semites. That progressive friends of Israel, whatever their criticisms of particular governments, must be willing to say unapologetically, I am a Zionist, and that I am a Zionist, not in spite of my belief in democracy, freedom, and equality, but because of those beliefs. Confronting the roots of anti-Semitism is a great moral challenge for all of us. We must speak out because every word has consequences, and every silence too. Well, I absolutely believe every word has consequences and every silence too. That includes incitement to genocide, including by the Israeli president who you lauded. I also believe every silence has consequences, Rachel, like your silence over the genocidal depravity unleashed by the state of Israel against the Palestinian people. Now, I also agree, by the way, that Zionism shouldn't be surrendered to conspiracy theories and anti-Semites. That term should not be, used, for example, to tackle Jewish people, or used, just against any Jewish person because they're Jewish, for example. It should be used with precision. It is the ideology which, in practice, has enshrined supremacy for the Jewish Israeli population over the Palestinian population. That's what it's done in practice. It has killed, vast numbers of Palestinians. It's driven from their homes. It's left them languishing under apartheid. Those are the facts. That's what actual people who know what they're talking about have long concluded in detailed studies. And you don't have anything to say about that. Because when you say, for example, that you're a Zionist because of your belief in democracy and freedom and equality, what does that mean? Because Palestinians do not have equal rights in the land which in practice is ruled by Israel, which is between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea. The people of the West Bank, who have been languishing under the longest hostile military occupation of modern times, they're deprived of basic rights and dignity and equality. In Israel proper, the so-called nation-state law, which was introduced a few years ago, enshrined in law that only the Jewish population of Israel has the right to national self-determination. In practice, Zionism is not reconcilable with democracy, freedom, and equality. It's an ethnocracy. It creates an ethno-state, a state which is explicitly run in the interest of only one ethnic group, at the detriment of another ethnic group. And what you do is you conflate anti-Semitism with that. We'll talk about that because you talk about the record increase in anti-Semitic incidents we have seen since the 7th of October attacks as a stain on this country. Look, actual anti-Semitism is an hideous evil. I've got no doubt that anti-Semitism is on the rise and it must be fought and confronted. That means, by the way, not conflating anti-Semitism with critiquing Israel, which is what has been happening in a cynical attempt to shut down scrutiny of Israel's crimes. She also ignores the surge in Islamophobic hate crimes, I must note, since 7th October. She goes on to say, we must tackle the root causes of anti-Semitism, not simply laud those who confront the symptoms. That means recognizing that hatred of the world's only Jewish state rests at the core of modern anti-Semitism. That we must reject wholeheartedly the belief that there's something inherently wrong about the right of the Jewish people to self-determination. And that doing so is a precondition to driving anti-Semitism off our streets, out of our schools, and away from our campuses. What she's doing here is an outright conflation of anti-Semitism and opposing the hideous genocidal crimes of the state of Israel. Look, just in terms of the cynicism of what she says, because the objection isn't to what she says is the right of the Jewish people to self-determination. It's to the deprivation of another people of that right. No people have any right to national self-determination at the expense of another people's right to national self-determination. Because what happened in the case of Israel is it was founded in the Nakba by driving hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their homes. 15,000 of them killed in the Nakba. That's what happened. And then in 1967, again, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians driven from their homes, and also many of them killed. And then subjected to the longest hostile military occupation of modern times, their land stolen and colonized. 700,000 illegal settlers, as I've said, in the West Bank. Mass incarceration, about 1 million Palestinian men incarcerated, subjected to torture, constantly murdered, huge numbers of Palestinians, including children, arbitrarily executed by the Israeli army. The crime of apartheid, as the likes of Amnesty International have established. The siege of Gaza before the genocide of Gaza. That's what people are objecting to, Rachel. That's what they're objecting to. You just say that's the right the objection to the right of the Jewish people to self-determination. No, they're objecting to that because they think Palestinians have equal rights. That's what they object to. And what you support in practice does not give Palestinians any equal rights at all in worth or anything. And what you're doing is dangerous because you're saying, what you're doing is stripping anti-Semitism of its actual meaning. And that puts Jewish people at risk because people just stop believing in anti-Semitism as a thing. They just start thinking, well, people are just using it to shut down opposing the crimes of Israel, so I don't believe in it anymore. You just stop it meaning anything. But it does mean something. It means prejudice and hatred of Jewish people. But how can we identify when it actually exists if it doesn't mean anything anymore because you've stripped it of its actual meaning in order to protect a state, which isn't the same as Jewish people? Because you talk about the hatred of the world's only Jewish state rests at the core of anti-Semitism. Define hatred. Define hate. What do you mean by hatred? Israel as a state, which consensus genocide scholars, including Israeli scholars of genocide, believe has committed genocide. Do you think it's hatred to call Israel a genocidal state, for example? I mean, when people say they hate a state which has committed genocide, I mean, if they say that, is that actual? Do you call that? Is that then? If for example, people talk, about another state which, whilst it's committing a genocide, and they start expressing how much they hate it, would you then describe that as a form of evil bigotry? I wouldn't actually. I think states that commit genocide cause people to get angry. For an obvious reason, because genocide is a crime of crimes. You can't commit a worse crime than genocide. It doesn't exist. She says, we all respect the right to protest. Oh my God. It's a fundamental part of who we are as a country. But we must also be clear that the first anti-Israel protests occurred while Israel was under attack. Now, they don't respect the right to protest. They've kept the Conservatives' anti-protest laws in place, which are the most restrictive attacks imaginable, pretty much in a democracy. I mean, they're making the right to protest almost impossible. And what they've done is prescribe Palestine Action, which is a non-violent direct action group, which sought to take on Britain's complicity in the genocide by, for example, throwing red paint at military planes. They got prescribed as a terrorist organisation by this Labour government, putting them on the same legal footing as ISIS and Al-Qaeda and violent neo-Nazis. You can go to prison for up to 14 years if you express support for them. Well over 2,000 people have been arrested for holding placards opposing genocide and saying they support Palestine Action. We all respect the right to protest, she says. And when she says that the first anti-Israel protest occurred while Israel was still under attack, I'm just going to call out the racism inherent in that argument, which has been made repeatedly by pro-Israel cheerleaders. Gaza was being attacked from the 7th of October onwards. It was being attacked before that, as I've said. But the Israeli onslaught against Gaza began on the 7th of October 2023. Within about 3 days, the official death toll of Palestinians, 3 to 4 days, was the same as the number of people killed in Israel on the 7th of October. That was the official death toll, which we, as I know, is an underestimate. Do you think Palestinians have equal worth, Rachel? Do you? Do you understand why people who do think Palestinians have equal worth were objecting to Israel beginning to wipe Gaza from the face of the earth, with Israeli leaders like Isaac Herzog, who you lauded, making clear their genocidal intent? That Israeli leaders and officials were saying that Palestinians had collective guilt, that the likes of Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, imposed a total siege on Gaza, which is completely illegal on the basis we are fighting human animals, and more genocidal statements. Israeli officials were saying that in the first few days that Gaza will become a city of tents. There'll be no buildings left. So you had the Israeli state unleashing hell against the people of Gaza, wiping it from the face of the earth, making clear they'd wipe it on the face of the earth, and making clear what they were going to do to the people of Gaza. Do you not see why people might want to protest that as it happened? What you're saying, again, is you don't think Palestinians have equal worth. Because you're acting as though the only people who have been killed at that time were Israelis. That's just not true. Hundreds of Palestinians have been killed from the very beginning. And those of us who took Israeli leaders at their word, which was the correct thing to do, knew that Israel was going to commit one of the worst crimes of our age. I said that at the beginning because I have reading comprehension. I read and listened to what Israeli leaders and officials said, and I took it literally. And guess what? It was right to do so because it was obvious what Israel was going to do from the very beginning because they made it clear. She goes on to say that the words, actions, and behaviour of some of those who have protested against Israel over the past 2 years have strayed into and even been driven by hate, by prejudice, by anti-Semitism, ripping down pictures of children kidnapped by Hamas, chanting death to the IDF and globalising intifada, equating the actions of Israel with those who murdered 6 million Jews. Well, as an example, let's talk about, say, death to the IDF. That is not anti-Semitism. I'm sorry, I'm just going to absolutely make that clear. Israel has committed genocide, as per, keep saying this, the consensus of genocide scholars, including Israeli genocide scholars and Israeli human rights organizations, according to a UN commission, according to NGOs like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. That is an army which has committed genocide. It's a genocidal army. Now, at the moment, for example, take Russia, which launched a legal and brutal and murderous invasion of Ukraine. Is chanting, if someone was chanting death to the Russian army, Rachel, would you regard that as anti-Russian racism? Honestly, would you? No, I mean, given the West is arming Ukraine, death to the Russian army is actually official policy of the West, so it'd be unlikely that you would agree to that. I think what you'd do if you heard death to the Russian army is you would see it as being motivated by revulsion at the war crimes being committed by the Russian army, wouldn't you? That's what you would see it as. Do you not understand that's why someone would chant death to the IDF? Now, when you say it's anti-Semitism to say equating the actions of Israel with those who murdered 6 million Jews, well, you mean I don't know why the Nazis who did that. They did. They committed, the Shoah, the industrialized extermination of the Jewish people. In terms of equating, genocides are not all the same. No, that's true. But what happened in the Holocaust, that grievous crime, is not the same as Israel's genocide of Gaza, in the same way that the Rwandan genocide is not the same. Or, for example, the genocide of the Rohingya people is not the same. Genocides are different. They happen in different ways. But, I mean, are you saying that because, what, the Rohingya people weren't gassed in gas chambers, that's not, for example, a genocide? No, you wouldn't say that. What they all have in common, Nazi Germany or Burma or Rwanda or Israel with Palestinian people, those are, we're talking about states that have committed genocide. It is not anti-Semitic to make the point that Israel is in a bracket of states which have committed genocide. That's not anti-Semitic, if that's what you're talking about. She goes on to say, talking about how it's anti-Semitism in terms of propagating dark conspiracies about the supposed power of the Zionist lobby. You're speaking to Labour Friends of Israel, Rachel. What do you think? What do you think LFI is? Do you think is that the Zionist lobby or not? Is that an organisation which is attempting to advance the interests of Israel in British politics? Yes or no? In the same way, Conservative Friends of Israel is doing the same thing. Yes or no? You know it is. What do you think AIPAC in the United States is doing? The pro-Israel lobby there. It's throwing vast sums of money at candidates which advance its interests and throwing vast sums of money to stop candidates who have spoken out about Israel's crimes. Is it anti-Semitic to talk about that? Do you actually think that? She talks about stirring the pot of community tensions to prevent Israeli football fans travelling to our second biggest city. Fucking hell. Wow. Are West Midlands police part of this conspiracy? Are they part of this anti-Semitic conspiracy, Rachel? Because Israeli football fans were banned from travelling at the say-so of West Midlands police because of the racist hooliganism which they displayed, for example, in Amsterdam, when as a fact, they tore down Palestinian flags. They, during a 1-minute silence for victims of the Valencia flood in Spain, they heckled it because they were angry at what they saw as Spain's stance on the genocide, which Spain has called out in Gaza. They attacked people in the streets, random people in the streets, which Israeli newspapers reported on, or people, for example, displaying pro-Palestinian sentiments. They chanted genocidal songs, including about how there's no schools left in Gaza because Israel's killed all the kids. The people who stirred the pot of community tension was your government. Because what happened is, to justify this attack, which then people will call anti-Semitic, for supporting the position of West Midlands police, is what happened there is Muslims in Birmingham then became demonized as being anti-Semitic. The argument was, well, it's because Israeli Jewish people are not safe because Muslims in Birmingham hate Jews. That's what this all became about, rather than being an objection to genocidal, racist football hooligans being on the rampage in, yes, our second biggest city. And your government tried to protect foreign football hooligans at the expense of your own people and your own communities, including, yes, British Muslims. The gaslighting. She says anti-Semitism is a crime. Gaslighting Jews simply compounds that crime. We must speak out because every word has consequences and every silence too. Yes, anti-Semitism is a crime, which you are making harder to identify by conflating. That's what you're doing. You're conflating what you call anti-Semitism when you're abusing the term with opposing the crimes of Israel. I agree that every silence has a consequence. Your silence, as I've said. Now, it says your silence on the genocide, which you help facilitate. She goes on to say the new emphasis placed on interfaith dialogue and tolerance by states such as the United Arab Emirates. Oh my goodness. The UAE is complicit in genocide in Sudan, Rachel. That's so you've not just lauded one genocidal state, you've now done a second one in one speech. Bravo, he must be very proud. The UAE has provided weapons to the Rapid Support Forces, which have engaged in mass killings, ethnic targeting, and sexual violence. UAE-based companies helped the Rapid Support Forces, for example, access the global financial system to allow their crimes to continue. What do you even say at this point? She says, and friends, you don't need me to tell you that these questions of anti-Semitism and Israel's right to exist are making themselves felt today in our domestic politics. On the left, we see political parties adopting the populist narratives of those who previously shouted in the streets. Who are you talking about? The main party of the left, which in some polls is the head of Labour, is the Green Party. Their leader is Zach Polanski, who is Jewish, Rachel. Are you accusing him of anti-Semitism? You shouldn't just say, on the left we see political parties, plural, and then not actually make clear who you're talking about. Who are you talking about and what are you saying about them? This speech is truly revealing. It's deeply revealing about Western governments in general, about the total lack of subtlety in not seeing Palestinians as having any meaningful worth, in whitewashing crimes that these governments have directly armed and facilitated. Rachel Reeves will be remembered as one of the worst chancellors on their own terms. I mean, which is a disastrous failure who almost no one supports in British public opinion. The most unpopular government in recorded history. She's a disaster. But she shouldn't just be remembered for that. She should be remembered for her role in a genocide and her role in whitewashing that genocide. What she has displayed here is contempt for the worth of Palestinians. And it's not those of us who believe Palestinians have the same rights and worth as everybody else who are the hateful, dangerous extremists. It's people who have supported one of the worst crimes of our age. And there is this attempt by those complicit in genocide to hide the truth, to airbrush the truth. But we won't let them get away with it. We must bear witness to what happened. We must expose the guilty men and women of this crime. Please like and subscribe. Please help us as we take on the pro-genocide media at patreon.com/Jones84. Do share the video. I'm finishing my book, The Fall of the West, which I'm due to hopefully finish by the end of February, and then it'll be out next autumn. Fingers crossed. I'll keep you updated about that. But it's nearly a festive time. We'll have a bit of a break. At least I can focus on my book. I'm going to be working over Christmas. And so we will probably vanish for a few days from Christmas Eve onwards. But I will say Happy Christmas tomorrow because we'll be there then. Speak to you in a bit.